A few years ago, many pundits in the car industry were saying that sedans were pretty much dead. And then the Tesla Model 3 came along, a fully electric sedan that really reinvigorated the non-SUV market around the world and indeed here in Australia. That's why for their second premium electric product, Hyundai have decided to introduce this, the Ioniq 6, which is a fully electric sedan that will go head to head with not just the Tesla Model 3, but a new wave of non-SUV electric cars, including things like the BMW i4 that have rated really well here on Chasing Cars. Because the proposition is simple. We all know that lower cars tend to ride and handle better, and when you make them fully electric, they should also be capable of some pretty great performance and of course lower emissions, at least when you use them day to day. Now in this video, we're going to walk through the Australian Ioniq 6 range. I'll let you know how much this vehicle costs and when you could probably get your hands on one. We'll check out the interior, the back seat and the boot, discuss the running costs, and then take a drive in the Ioniq 6. This one is the top of the range Epiq dual motor all-wheel drive model, but over the last couple of days I've spent a lot of time driving the full range of Ioniq 6 models, including the cheapest rear-wheel drive car, and you might be surprised by just how good that particular vehicle is. But before we get started, hit subscribe down below. Chasing Cars, honest reviews of your next car. Brought to you by Direct. Access to the interior of the new Ioniq 6 comes by way either of the new key, which is designed to look like the Hyundai logo when you turn it 90 degrees, or via the Bluelink app that you can install on your smartphone. You get 5 years of complimentary services for Bluelink with this car. You can unlock the car, lock it, set the climate control, start or stop charging. There's a plethora of options available through the app. What there isn't though is the ability to use your phone as a key. And Hyundai does have that in some overseas markets. Tesla notably has it standard here in Australia. BMW has it on most of their range as well. Sadly, Hyundai Australia yet to take up that important technology. But that aside, the interior of the Ioniq 6 is a really nice place to spend time. Straight out of the gate, it's more conventional than some other EVs on the market, so you might find it a little bit more familiar. What I can tell you is that the ergonomics are really good because you've got dedicated climate controls down here. You've got your infotainment, navigation, wired only Apple CarPlay and Android Auto still through this center touchscreen here. And then you've got all of your important driver info in a separate 12.3-inch screen in front of you. They're big, they're bright, they're crisp. One small piece of trivia though is that your driver's screen always shows you your range prediction in big numbers. And this car's got really long range, so I don't think that sort of anxiety-inducing number needs to be quite so front and center all the time. That's just me though. You're welcome to disagree with me down below in the comments. Now the actual appearance of the Ioniq 6 interior is really governed by the color of it. Now this car is in gravity gold matte outside and it's matched with the white interior, which is very, very modern, super bright. It really gives you an airy feeling, but of course you are going to have to tend to these leather seats to keep dye stains off, whether you get them treated when you buy the car or you're just diligent with your cleaning. You're going to have to do that. There are two black interiors, there's a brown interior. They're all paired to an exterior color. But Hyundai Australia, very exciting, they say they're going to implement a build to order program, hopefully by the end of this year, where you'll be able to pick and choose exterior color, trim, maybe even things like battery size and wheel size, options that they've never really let you choose on your own before, which is pretty awesome. In terms of the tech, it all works fairly intuitively. It's probably not as deep or as immersive as the system that you would get on something like the Model 3, but it works well. I just wonder why, for your charging sessions, you don't have things like Netflix or other streaming services that you could watch on this screen here. What you do have though is the amazing relaxation comfort seat on the top two grades of Ioniq 6, where you can lay right back and have a nap while this car blasts to 80% in just 18 minutes on a compatible 350 kilowatt charger, because this is an 800 volt EV, unlike most of its competitors. The seat itself is fairly comfortable. It could use a little bit more under thigh support for long journeys, but on the whole, I was happy with the seat. And in the Techniq and Epiq models, you also get seat cooling. However, the base model, the rear-wheel drive, which is called the Dynamiq trim, has almost everything you need. Sadly, it doesn't have seat coolers and you can't option a sunroof, but it still has leather, it still has all the best tech, and it still has things like a Bose premium stereo, which is really well tuned in this car, and your music sounds great. In terms of build quality, the cars I've driven, several of them, have been immensely good. Not a single rattle, not a creak, everything fits together absolutely perfectly. Now, whether Hyundai selected perfect cars to be their press cars is always an option, but the quality in here just feels insanely good for the amount of content in this car, and that's great. In terms of some of the materials, most of them are reasonably premium, and most of them are actually recycled or kind of bio-sustainable in some way. Some of them, like these door cards, are going to be a bit harder than you expect. That's a recycled plastic bottle. Other ones are going to be a little bit more squidgy, but the stuff that you touch, like the leather steering wheel, they all feel good. And just lastly on that note, you actually can't get a vegan or vegan-like interior in this car right now. There are cloth seats available overseas. They're under consideration for Australia later on. The back seat of the Ioniq 6 isn't quite as strong as up front. In terms of the basic room on offer, it's definitely good, and the legroom is palatial on this car's 2,950mm wheelbase. However, the Ioniq 6, because it's not an SUV, it's a more low, fun-to-drive sedan, it comes up against the same packaging constraints that most EVs come up against. And that's that we are sitting on the battery. It sits in the floor plan of the car between the two axles, and it's a big battery, 74 kilowatt hours of usable space in this car. And that drives up the floor of the vehicle. And because this is a non-SUV, it's a sedan, it's got a lowish roofline, and that means our headroom just isn't quite as good. I can feel my hair just brushing the headliner. I'm 6 foot tall, so if most of your backseat passengers are not as tall as that, then they probably won't notice any issue. However, there's an ancillary problem too, and that's that high floor drives up your foot position basically. And so in order to get comfortable, you can't have your legs straight because there's a gap between your leg and the seat, so you have to splay your legs. Now, certainly not the end of the world. We are facing bigger problems in the world than that, and the Ioniq 6 is not as bad as the Polestar 2 or the Mercedes EQA or EQB in this regard. It's also about the same as the Tesla Model 3. However, cars like the Porsche Taycan and the Audi e-tron GT, which are way more expensive than this car, they actually have little cutouts in the battery structure so that your feet have a place to go. That's obviously quite a premium feature. So space aside, what else have we got here in the back? Well, we've got air vents, more USB-C fast charging ports. We've got some soft materials here on the armrest, but still the hard doors. But we also have rear seat heaters, which is good. More efficient to heat people using seat heaters than air conditioning in an EV. Plus we have a flip down armrest here, nice substantial piece with 2 cup holders in it. So as long as your back passengers aren't too tall, if they even exist at all, because I think a lot of people who buy this car won't really use the back seats for more than a gym bag, well then everyone's going to be happy in the back of the Ioniq 6. Now, well, on the whole, I think the Ioniq 6 is a pretty good looking car. I think most people would agree that the rear angle is probably the most challenging styling wise. It's certainly very interesting, but I think it's going to be something of an acquired taste out on the road. My personal tip is that I actually think the Ioniq 6 looks best in lighter colors. Now, this is the very, very interesting Gravity Gold Matte. The car comes in a range of other colors. The dark ones can be elegant too, but I actually think on a lighter color, you sort of see some of the design intricacies a little bit better, and it makes a little bit more sense to me. But certainly some would argue that they didn't know when to put the pencil down back here, but you know, it's at least interesting, and we see so many samey vehicles out on the road. So I guess there's that. You can let me know your opinion down below. Now here we have a sedan style boot. There's a button to access that boot here on the back boot itself, and that opens up to reveal a relatively narrow aperture and 401 litres of cargo space, so certainly not the biggest boot and a lot less practical than the Ioniq 5, which is shorter than this car, but because it has that large hatchback or sort of wagon SUV body to it, it's easier to load stuff in the back. Now, unfortunately, none of the Ioniq 6s for Australia have a spare wheel of any kind. Even the base model on 18s, I was hopeful that would have a spare. They all have a tyre mobility kit, but they also have a little bit more storage space underneath a soft boot floor. In terms of special features, you can drop the rear seats from within the boot, so you can carry longer items that way. And you've got controls here to close the boot or to close it and lock the vehicle at the same time. Of course, the costs of not doing a wagon or SUV form factor are always going to be reduced boot space, and it's a similar story here around the front. Now, this car does have a Frunk or a Fruit, but if you go for the all-wheel drive model, you get 14.5 litres, and that's enough to stash the granny charger here that I've got in this car, but I actually don't think you'd be able to pour 14.5 litres of water or milk or something into this Frunk. It's absolutely tiny. Now, if you go for the rear-wheel drive version, it is a little bit bigger, but it doesn't meet the packaging gold standard that is the Tesla Model 3, which has an 88-litre Frunk on that car, despite having dual motors. When it comes to running costs, Hyundai has made a recent improvement with their Ioniq grade EVs. You don't have to service them every 12 months anymore. From 2023, both this new Ioniq 6 and the Ioniq 5 only need to be serviced every 2 years or 30,000 kilometers. And they only cap that though for the 4 years or 60,000 kilometers at $1,120 for the set of 2 services. So you can take that into account. In terms of the warranty, there's a 5-year unlimited kilometer warranty on the vehicle, but an 8-year warranty on the high voltage components. It's good to keep in mind that the Kia EV6, which is similar in size, has a 7-year unlimited kilometer vehicle warranty here in Australia, but this beats the Tesla Model 3, which only has a 4-year vehicle warranty. And when it comes to energy efficiency, well, we're expecting big things from the Hyundai Ioniq 6, and you'll need to hit subscribe in order to catch our full highway range and recharging test on this car in the coming weeks, which we're going to run on the rear-wheel drive and the all-wheel drive. Now, on my initial drive of this vehicle, I've been mainly driving on country roads at about 100 kilometers per hour, some town stuff here in a big regional town in New South Wales. And the figures haven't quite gotten as close as I would have expected to Hyundai's claims. With the rear-wheel drive, I managed about 18 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometers, and with this all-wheel drive, I got about 21. So keeping in mind that driving was definitely of a more intense level than what you'd normally do in these cars. But that implies a range of just over 400 kilometers for the rear-wheel drive and about 350 kilometers for the all-wheel drive. Now, given the headline figures are closer to 600 kilometers, I'm certainly hoping that on that more modest driving style on the highway, we're going to get something like 15 kilowatt hours per 100 Ks out of the rear drive and at least get that range above 500 kilometers. But that test is yet to come, so ensure you're subscribed. So let's take a drive in the new Hyundai Ioniq 6. As I mentioned, this one is the Epiq all-wheel drive. It's a top of the range dual motor 239 kilowatt model. Well, top of the range until the end version arrives, perhaps at the end of next year. But I have driven the rear wheel drive quite extensively over the last couple of days as well. And I hope to tell you what the differences are like between the two and whether you really need the all-wheel drive. And it's particularly pertinent because, as you can probably see, it's a bit of a rainy day today. We're in Albury, some absolutely awesome driving roads outside this country town on the border of New South Wales and Victoria out here in Australia. The kinds of roads that will really challenge any vehicle, honest roads, so you can tell how a car actually drives. But let's start with your choice of powertrain, because there's only one model that has the rear-wheel drive motor and there are 2 all-wheel drive models. In future, it's pretty likely the range will be expanded out to maybe include the smaller battery, which we currently don't get in Australia, and perhaps an additional rear-wheel drive model with a higher trim grade. But that car has a single motor on the rear axle with 168 kilowatts of power and 350 Newton meters of torque. So it's kind of comparable to something like a BMW 320i or 330i in that way. A nicely balanced rear drive car. Doesn't have too much power, but it's also not underpowered in that sense. But of course, a lot of people want to go for the all-wheel drive, which adds a second motor on the front axle, a smaller motor. So it's still dominant rear drive bias, this car, but the total output's at 239 kilowatts of power and 605 Newton meters of torque. And that gets us to the Ioniq 6's headline 0 to 100 claim of 5.1 seconds, which we'll be testing independently soon. But we found that Hyundai's EVs come pretty close to their claims in many regards. We'll also be testing the brakes at that point, but from my country driving and town driving over the last couple of days, I found the brakes to be pretty good in this car. Both the regenerative sense, where you've got 3 levels of regen controlled by paddles on the steering wheel, and also an I-pedal function, which is a 1-pedal drive mode that can completely stop the car. And then when you need to use the actual disc brakes of the vehicle, they have decent pedal feel for an EV. Definitely less weird, less wooden than a lot of other EVs out there on the market. Like most electric cars, the Ioniq 6 just has a single-speed automatic transmission. It's not like the Porsche Taycan where you've got a cruising gear for the highway, which can lead to higher efficiency. This car gets it all done with 1 gear, much like the Tesla Model 3. And the range is kind of similar to that car as well, in that it offers that choice of rear drive or all-wheel drive, but at the moment the Ioniq 6 doesn't have a performance model. However, we know that's coming in future. Hyundai will release an Ioniq 5N, a sports SUV, in Australia, probably by the end of 2023. And then the next car to follow in that lineup will be an Ioniq 6N based on the existing RN22E concept, which I've driven a couple of times, and you can watch my review of that car on the channel. But what is this vehicle really like to drive? Well, it starts with the experience of the motors, which are pretty refined in this car. Certainly more refined than the motors in Volvo or Polestar product, where there's actually a little bit of graininess in the motor at low speed. In the Ioniq 6, the motors are near silent and they deliver power in such a linear and silken fashion that it's really just a pleasure to operate the vehicle, build or reduce speed. It's so smooth and so refined. There's virtually no whine in the system. But really the best part of driving this car is the ride and handling, which is not something that we can normally say for an EV. Most EVs that cost less than $100,000 just ride badly. That's a fact. Partially it's because of the fact that they're heavy, because batteries weigh a lot, but it's also because their wheels and tires are heavy too to support that weight. And wheels and tires are actually unsprung weight, so they tend to clang through potholes and really crash into the cabin. That isn't the case with the Hyundai Ioniq 6, and it becomes one of a very small club of EVs that actually ride properly without costing the earth. Now, Australia didn't tune this car locally, Hyundai Australia. Instead, engineers from Hyundai Australia travelled to Germany and Korea to ensure that their preferences were being incorporated into the final product. But the tune that's running on the Aussie spec Ioniq 6 is identical to the European car. Now, instead of being too firm like some European cars are on Aussie roads, it ends up landing at about the perfect point. The body control is really good. This car doesn't flop or roll or create seasickness as you're barreling down a country road. Instead, it feels tight and well controlled, but not at the expense of ride quality, which has an underlying firmness to it. You can tell what's going on the road, but it is not crashy at all. It's supple and well insulated, especially on the base model, which has 18-inch wheels and a chunkier tire. That's really the best riding of all Ioniq 6s, but even here on the 20-inch wheels and grippy Pirelli P0 tires, the ride quality is way more than acceptable. In fact, it's good, and I'm really happy to see that Hyundai has achieved that with this car. It also has the frequency selective dampers that had their debut on the Kia EV6, but they're also now fitted to the Ioniq 5 electric SUV too. And they definitely do wonders for the ability of this car to control bumps that come up mid-corner. Now, when it comes to handling, the Ioniq 6 is pretty fun to drive. The rear-wheel drive model is probably the most pure in that sense. It's got about 100 kilos less over the front axle, which definitely helps its turn-in zeal. It's not quite as powerful, so you have to work it a bit harder, which is fun as a driver, but by default it's fitted with Nexon Eco tires. Now, if you're like me, that can actually be quite fun because the car tends to slip and slide a little bit more, but if you were buying that car, I'd probably go out and fit it with some solid Continental, Michelin or Pirelli tires pretty quickly to enhance its grip levels. But especially for the all-wheel drive models on the 20-inch wheels and Pirelli P0 tires, this car has phenomenal grip levels. You can really push it hard through corners. A car just stays stable and tracks true to the line that you're asking for through the steering. Now, speaking of the steering, the rack is not the most clear or precise, but it's a decently intuitive ratio. It gets the job done. There's just virtually nothing by way of steering feel. And unlike some EVs, the Ioniq 6 doesn't have something like four-wheel steering. All the steering is happening at the front axle, which is actually the way I tend to like it anyway. Now, when it comes to refinement, this car is seriously impressive. Not only do the tires have a foam layer within them because they are EV tires, so that helps to dull down road noise, but the glass is insulated across all models, and this is a quiet car, even on coarse chip country roads. Certainly quieter than my long-term Polestar 2 dual motor was when I was running that car, so that's impressive. On the safety front, well, this car is at the leading edge, and that in some ways, unfortunately, means it incorporates all of the features that are required under European regulations, even though Australia is not privy to the European Union's laws. And that means the speed limit warning system that we've seen on other recent Hyundai Kia and Genesis models. If you exceed what the car thinks the speed limit is, even by 1 km/h, it starts binging and bonging very, very annoyingly at you. And that's the case even if it's misread a speed sign, it's seen a 10-kilometer sign somewhere and you're on a 50 or 60 km/h road. It's binging, it's bonging, and you have to turn it off every single time the car is switched on. Now, there's no good reason for this feature to be fitted as standard in Australia, given it's not required in our market, and Hyundai should have had the attention to detail to remove it before they released the car here. Sadly, that hasn't happened. Good features though are the presence of actually very clear digital mirrors on the top end model. You could argue you don't really need those, and that's true, but the blind spot cameras that you get on all models in the driver's screen are excellent as a way to check your blind spot. We also have forwards and reversing autonomous emergency braking, even AEB for junctions and oncoming traffic. If somebody veers into your oncoming lane, the car will wipe off as much speed as possible to reduce the severity of that accident. And the lane centering system on the Ioniq 6 is really excellent, one of the best on the market in terms of finding the middle of the lane and sticking there, which makes road trips a lot less fatiguing. So on the whole, the Ioniq 6 has really, really impressive driving dynamics for an EV. And even compared to the Ioniq 5, which came out 2 years ago, the improvement is palpable. And it's clear that the Ioniq cars are on a really good trend in terms of where their dynamics are going. So it'll be exciting to see what the next ones, the Ioniq 5N, a hypothetical Ioniq 6N, and the Ioniq 7 3-row SUV are like when those cars come out. So those are my initial opinions of the new Hyundai Ioniq 6, an EV that has a lot of promise because it is seriously enjoyable and comfortable to drive. It has great body control, it has supple ride quality, it has agile handling, and it has an interesting chassis that if you're a keen driver, you'll actually look for opportunities to get behind the wheel of this car. You'll look for country roads to take it on. And that's actually not something we say about many EVs at all. So the Ioniq 6 joins a very, very limited class of EVs that are seriously good to drive. For me, the big outstanding question right now is what is this car's genuine road trip range, driving range and recharging times? Because its efficiency out on great country roads is definitely worse than the WLTP claim. We always expect that, but sort of 400 Ks of range for the rear wheel drive is some way off Hyundai's headline numbers. So let's see what it will actually do on the highway in a future video coming up soon on the Chasing Cars channel. So don't forget to subscribe to see that one in future. Now it's over to you. Let me know your thoughts on the new Hyundai Ioniq 6, not just the styling, which I know everybody has something to say about, but the rest of the car too, down there below the video in the comment section. While you're there, hit subscribe, hit the notification bell, and as always, thanks for watching Chasing Cars.